Welcome back to the Water Matters podcast. Pleased to be recording another episode number 5, I believe. And I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Smedley back to join me for this episode. Tim, how are you?
I'm really good. Good to be back.
Good. Thank you for joining me. We've got a very interesting topic today to discuss. Slightly different from the previous episodes, but we're recording this on what we like to call #Water Wednesdays. Our newsletter has gone out this morning to our subscribers to the Water Matters digital newsletter. And this morning I remember writing in the email that went to the subscribers this morning just how regular the recent storms have been. I knew that when we started this process with the Water Matters platform, I knew that kind of contributing or adding written content to the website and articles, and especially the newsletter every 2 weeks, would focus the mind about what's happening in the world of Water Matters. But what I didn't really think about at all that would happen is that I would realize just how regular and extreme these storms have been. I mean, we do seem to have been hit with them a lot recently. If I think back to 3 editions ago, we mentioned the Valencia flooding over in Spain, which, of course, from a rainfall and flooding perspective was particularly awful and unexpected or sort of out of the ordinary. And then 2 weeks after that, we had Storm Bert, and we wrote an article about that. And of course, episode 3, I think it was on the podcast, the last one that we did together, was all about storms. And so I have been encouraging people, if they're wondering why these storms are seemingly getting more often and more severe, then we do talk about that a lot on episode 3 of the podcast. So I would encourage people to listen to that if you haven't already. But then even more recently this weekend, yet another storm with yet more devastating consequences, which is, I think I'm certainly more aware of it because I'm writing a lot about it and we're sharing this content more often. But does it feel to you, Tim, like it's happening more than we're used to?
It is, definitely. So since starting to write the book, I've kept a back garden rain gauge, and I got quite into it for the first 2 or 3 years. Now I just kind of check it for extreme rain events, and I still keep a log. I still keep a spreadsheet. So I kind of know, even in those 4 years, these storms have been unusual. Mm-hmm. So I've forgotten the names of all the named storms. We're racking up so many named storms this winter. But certainly the one in early September, which is probably the first one, that was around 140 millimetres of rainfall in a weekend. So that's a typical wet month, 140 millimetres.
Yeah.
In a weekend, I hadn't recorded anything like that before, so that was really unusual. Then about 2 weeks ago, about the same happened again. It was about 120 millimetres, but this was after a couple of wet months. So, yeah, the centre of Banbury where we're recording this was flooded. The local parks and the local theatre was flooded. The car parks were flooded. Yeah. So, yes, it's been quite extreme. And it's been really surprising to see 2 such rain events, having not recorded a single one in those 4 or 5 years, to suddenly have 2 in 2 months. Mm. But again, it goes back to what we talked about last time, in that these are becoming more frequent. They are becoming more extreme. We've now seen the evidence of it, and it's not just Valencia, it's not just other countries, it's now happening here. And again, it goes back to that stat of for every 1 degree raise in global temperature, you get 7% more moisture in the air. So all of these storms coming through, we've had storms before, will have storms, always have had storms, but as the storms come through now, they're holding more moisture in them. Yeah. So they're dropping more rain. But it has been quite mind-blowing to actually see it happening here as well as internationally. Yeah.
No, it has, and I only I only hope. I mean, there will be a little extended break because 2 weeks' time is actually Christmas Day itself, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and storms are not allowed on Christmas Day.
So storms clearly are not allowed at Christmas. I'm also not going to write and send. I'm not going to bother anyone with a Water Matters newsletter on Christmas Day. So I definitely won't be writing about another storm in 2 weeks' time. But I hope that in 4 weeks' time, when we send the first edition out in January, which I think will be the 10th of January, if I'm not mistaken, I hope that between now and then we can get through 4 weeks without yet another storm. But, because of creating this content and sharing this information, I will definitely know whether there has been. We are a bit like you, kind of keeping an eye on it and keeping a record of it. And I think if nothing else, looking back on all of this as we get into next year, the year after that, it will we will have quite a lot of information to actually see over that span of time. Is it getting worse? Is it changing? What's happening? It'll be very interesting to look back on.
Yeah, and I know it's not the topic of today's podcast, but just on that point, I'm really hoping that it just raises the conversation of how we deal with floods and floodwater. And it's really interesting this week, in fact, it might even have been yesterday, we just had an announcement from the government about kind of ripping up red tape on building regulations and letting builders kind of build on greenbelt where they haven't previously been allowed. I really hope that's done mindfully of flood plains and flood defences, because basically what we're seeing now is, having built on floodplains and having tarmacked and asphalted a lot of areas where we would be better off seeing water seep down into our aquifers, that's causing part of the problem. So flooding isn't just extreme rainfall, it's where that water has to go, where it's allowed to go. I know that's part of the conversation in Valencia now. So they're seeing, okay, what do we do with floodwaters? How can we help it seep into the environment? We need that conversation happening more here. There's lots of good work happening. I've seen really good river and floodplain restoration work, the National Trust and so on. Often it's kind of on private land. It's in large national trust estates. It's kind of got to start happening now with the big house builders and with government and the Environment Agency. I know they all kind of know these issues, but currently, where's the politics going to go? Is it going to go more towards the build more houses, or is it going to start recognising the environmental needs? Because what's the point of building houses if they're just going to flood?
Yes. And I mean, we have had since launching this podcast and the website and the newsletter, and sharing much of the content on socials, we have had a couple of people reach out to us about their own personal experience of their property flooding since some changes were made in their local environment to the road layout, and then some more houses being built and so on and so on. And this happened, I think this incident is over in East Anglia somewhere. And, up to 4 years ago, never flooded. Some stuff changed, some new properties were built, some road layout was changed. Since then, 3 floods in a row. It's like, it has to be related. But to your point, and especially with the ambitious kind of numbers in terms of housing and really that the government are talking about in terms of numbers of houses they want to start building year on year, surely, yes, it has to be considered, one would hope. Because if both increase, then it has to be
and not just considered, but it should be central to how those building applications, building developments go ahead. So you can build more houses. Obviously, we need more houses. They can go on greenbelt, okay, but they just can't go on floodplains. And it has to involve, for my mind, some restoration upstream of the river and floodplains outside of the town. That's almost the more important point. We've got to restore floodplains and the natural flood defences of rivers, beaver dams being one of them, or just man-made leaky dams. Those are what you need upstream, so that when the floods have somewhere to sit and stay and seep down before it reaches the town. So I'm really hopeful that's going to be a big part of the conversation in 2025.
And we will do all we can to continually sort of discuss it ourselves and share helpful information with anyone interested in listening and reading the content, but hopefully not over the next 4 weeks or even a couple of months. Let's hope we've seen the last.
So Water Wednesdays suspended for the rest of the year now.
Indeed, they are. We'll be back on track 10th of January. But everyone can just enjoy Christmas first, hopefully without any storms. So let's change the topic. Let's change the subject. This episode, we are introducing a new subject, a subject that we have not, certainly we've not talked about on the podcast before. You have recently contributed an article which has been shared on the watermatters.life website. And so perhaps some people have read that. Let's assume that they haven't. Let's assume that no one knows anything about And let's start off with the basics. The subject is microplastics, microplastics in water, more specifically. And in the article, certainly you begin by going into quite a lot of detail about the global issue of this and what is happening, or rather, sadly, or frustratingly not happening from a government and sort of legislation perspective. But let's come on to that a bit later. Let's start off, if you would be so kind, by just making sure that everyone understands what are microplastics, why should they care, and let's begin the conversation there, and before we navigate our way to what's happening and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So microplastics, what are they? Microplastics are any tiny fragment of plastic that's below 5 millimeters or less. Typically, though, it's even less than that. So often microplastics can get so small that you can't see them. But if you imagine like picking up a handful of sand in a beach, if you looked into those grains of sand, as we know, it's often little broken up rocks and broken up shells. There will also be broken up plastics. They're kind of a sand grain size. But also, I mean, literally that handful of sand will include some microplastics in most beaches that you go to. So microplastics are everywhere. I think one big misunderstanding about microplastics is that people think of them as already appearing in micro form. It's mostly from large plastic waste, plastic bottles, plastic tubs, any large plastic thing you can imagine, or carrier bags that have ended up in water, typically the sea. So rivers flow to the sea carrying plastics. The sea, as some people may know, has kind of huge islands of plastics now that are formed, especially in the mid-Atlantic. When it's there, over time, that plastic degrades. It bangs together, it buffs up. That forms lots of little plastic shards that come off it. Then you've got microplastics. Some microplastics, however, do appear just in the micro form. So your clothes washing, for example, if you've got any polyester clothes or any plastic fiber clothes, most people do. It's quite hard to avoid them now. Bits of those fibers will come off with each clothes wash. That goes out down the drain into the river and forms large amounts of microplastics. I know you didn't want to get onto the big figures yet, but there is a study that shows that for every 6 kilogram clothes wash with unnatural fibers clothing, you get 700,000 microplastic fibers produced from just one wash. So it kind of shows you how, we get through at least one wash a day on a house, and it's often bigger than 6 kilos. So if you think of all those washes accumulating, there's a lot of microplastics going out in our environment.
Yeah. And so even if people are unfamiliar with it, and this is the first time they're hearing about it, which I doubt, because it is a word that's been in the news a lot over the last few years, increasingly. But we're all probably contributing to the problem, perhaps without even realizing it.
Yeah, we are, but I don't want to get too blamey about this one, because it's really hard to avoid.
Yeah.
Like you can, if you work hard at it, you can replace your whole wardrobe with natural fibers. That is doable.
Yeah.
That's quite hard. Not a single bit of elastic in a waistline.
Yeah.
It's none of your buttons on your shirt can be plastic. Yeah. Most things involve some plastic now. So there is a personal contribution side, and I think we'll get onto it.
Yeah.
But mostly it's just the point is just how much plastic is in our environment now, and in our houses, in our clothing, in our cars. It's really hard to avoid.
Yes, and it makes sense that even if people are incredibly conscientious about recycling any plastic that they use or come into contact with or whatever, it's inevitable that because of the way it breaks down and there will always be some residue of microplastics coming from that. Even if you are the most environmentally conscious person, you recycle absolutely everything, it's unavoidable, really.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is unavoidable, really. I also wrote another article recently called "Is Recycling a Lie?" Which is a purposefully challenging title, because I do believe in recycling. We all need to recycle.
Yeah.
But the sheer amount of plastic in our lives now is too much to recycle.
Right.
So there's good evidence that the petrochemical industry has kind of encouraged the lie of recycling, saying, well, it's all fine as long as we recycle it.
Yeah.
But there's such huge volumes now, we can't recycle it all.
Yes.
Developing countries haven't managed to do it. America only manages to recycle about 5% of its plastics. That's the richest country in the world.
Yeah.
No country recycles 100%. And even if we did theoretically hit 100%, most plastics only recycle once before they're degraded to an unusable standard. So it's not like aluminium. Aluminium you can recycle forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
Without losing much of that aluminium. With plastics recycling, you need to add a bit of virgin plastic to make it reusable again. So there's not really a recycling means out of this problem, because you'll always have to add some virgin plastic.
Yeah.
And the plastic you are recycling gets less and less usable and ends up as waste anyway. So the idea that we can recycle it all was always a myth, I've kind of come to believe. And there's just too much of it. And I was talking about developed countries there. Developing low-income countries just don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So they're just getting shoved full of plastics from the plastics producing countries and companies. And there's no means of recycling it. So it's ending up in rivers, it's ending up in seas.
And talking about plastic ending up in places, before we go on to the sort of negative aspects, the real sort of horrors of microplastics and why people should be aware of it, and what it can cause, let's talk about where it can be found, because it's managing it, or there, I'm not sure what the correct word is, it's managing to find its way really into nearly every water source, is it not?
Yes, it is found in every water source. So the studies of tap water found it in the majority of tap water. It wasn't 100%, but most tap water will have some microplastics in it. But it was kind of single figure shards in each kind of large glass of tap water. But there's some. But the real shocking one was when they repeated the study with bottled water. So often, I'm not going to name any brands, but often the kind of the premium brands, they're sold as the healthy option.
Yeah.
They had 3,000 to 8,000% increase in microplastics, so hundreds of microplastic shards
compared with
your ordinary tap water. So it's a big tick in the box of your ordinary tap water, which we've given a pounding on this podcast before, I think, and I may well do later in this one. But in terms of microplastics, tap water is better, but it's still found in it.
Yes.
It's found in our foods. It bioaccumulates up the food chain. It's found in seawater. But here's the stat that really shocked me. So we all now consume a credit card's worth of plastic every week. So that's in our water, in our food, because it's unavoidable.
Yes.
I could give a slight positive slant in that our bodies are designed to deal with impurities. We will excrete most of that, but not all of it.
Yeah.
So some of it is inflaming our organs. Some of it is causing us problems.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. So I got into microplastics for the pollution chapter of my book, and I did speak to. I was speaking to a couple of experts now who are a bit more relaxed about it, saying, well, plastic's inert. It's used for medical procedures. It's not toxic, which is true. So there's other things that are a bigger concern, such as forever chemicals, which we might get onto as well, other pollutants that kind of have a more directly toxic effect. However, I feel things have moved on even in a couple of years on that subject, just because of the sheer increase in pollution, microplastic pollution.
Yeah.
The studies have found it now in our bloodstream, in women's fetus, in placentas of pregnant women. Yeah. So that's concerning for many reasons. One, because it's passing on to the fetus, an unborn fetus, but also it's a human organ that's only around for 8 months.
So it's happening quickly.
Yeah, it's happening quickly, but also consider the organs that we have all the time and the possible accumulation over that time.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting studies I've seen that's quite persuasive is a link with IBS, with irritable bowel syndrome. So that's increased over recent years, and there's been a medical question as to why. one theory is microplastics, and there's a really interesting study, I think it was done in China, of IBS patients, and they found they had 50% more microplastics in their feces compared to non-IBS patients. Right. So there suggests a link there with an inflammation of the bowel from microplastics. So the inert point is true, except that it depends where the microplastics have come from. So if they've got they could have toxic dyes or toxic paints on the surface, and they could be carrying them into us that way anyway. But there is an inflammation accumulation point which is valid even if it's inert. So if our blood and organs are being clogged by microplastics, that is a problem, inert or not.
Yes. And so hopefully people are beginning, if they weren't sure at the start, after that explanation, people now understand why this is a very relevant topic for people to know about and really understand. Because even if you did everything you can to avoid it, just through living your life, through buying clothes from places most people buy clothes from, through drinking either tap water or bottled water, or putting any kind of water into your teas, coffees, all that sort of stuff, and simply through eating the food that we buy to live, and through that consuming one credit card's worth of plastic per week, correct? Then it's, again, not completely unavoidable, I'm sure. To the extremes, you'd be able to find a way around it if you really, really want to. But of course, the majority are not. And therefore, it is a very relevant topic for people to understand, to have a general understanding of what is it, why should I care? And you've started to touch on there some of the negatives that can happen because of it. I think, so hopefully, very interesting. Clearly, this is not new. It's something that countries and governments and organizations have been aware of for a long time. Stuff is happening, of course. And some of the topics that you talked about in the start of the article that you've contributed, which, of course, I would encourage people to go to the watermatters.life website and read. But things are happening, but perhaps not as quickly as we would like, such is the case with most of these things. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, definitely. And we will get onto some kind of positives on how people can reduce exposure. There's definitely good ways we can reduce our exposure to microplastics, just through personal choices. Mm-hmm. But it is also true that there's no way of eradicating exposure. We all need to eat and drink, and there's currently no microplastic-free options there, unfortunately. No. But in terms of the kind of what's happening globally, so this is why I've got plastics as a kind of a bee in my bonnet currently. Mm-hmm. So at the end of November, start of December, there was a UN treaty in Busan in South Korea, which was dubbed the Plastics Treaty, and it was hoped to be, or even billed to be, the likely Paris Agreement equivalent for plastics. So all the usual suspects from the UN were there. There was a lot of positive mood music going into the talks. There was a proposal put on board by, I think it was led by Tanzania and Peru, with other countries supporting it, pushing for a 40% reduction in plastic production. So the idea being that production has just gone up and up and up so much that we need to get production down before we almost do anything else. And in fact, in terms of plastics going up, I'm just going to read this stat. So, because we all think perhaps, probably none of us are old enough to remember a life before plastic. I mean, arguably the first plastic was invented in the 1900s, so no one's going to be around to remember that. So it feels like plastics have always been in our lives. But actually a large part of this is a recent increase. So the world now produces over 400 million tons of plastics every year, but that's double that from the year 2000. So that's doubled in just over 20 years. So you got that fact being, I found that quite shocking in that that's quite a short-term time to see that incredible increase. Now, so a 2024 article in Nature showed that the production of plastics in 1950 amounted to 2 million tons. So you've gone from 2 million to 200 million in the year 2000, but then to 400 million in 2024. You can see the way that graph is going. And if the graph continues in that way, by 2060, it will be 1,231 million tons. So we're already seeing that we can't recycle this amount. There's absolutely no way we will be able to recycle double again and then double again. So the huge volumes of plastic, that's the issue.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's the breaking down of those plastics. Even, as I say, plastics that have been recycled, they eventually break down and are no longer usable for recycling. So just that sheer volume of plastics in our lives we can't deal with it. So anyway, there is a really positive progressive movement to go in with this 40% reduction target to be signed, but it was shut down. In the talks, basically the major oil producing companies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, just said, no, we won't be doing that. And also they even said publicly, the issue is recycling, not plastic production. As long as you recycle it, you're fine. So it was kind of gaslighting, really. The major oil producing countries were gaslighting us, saying, it's your problem. We're giving you the plastics. You deal with it. Unfortunately, we're seeing the result of that. So it's quite a frustrating time. It was quite a big blow for people that were going into the talks with some hope, myself included. The only thing that was agreed on, this was supposed to be the fifth and final talk. This was the agreement talks. There were 4 talks leading to this one. But the only thing that was agreed on was, we'll do a 6th and final talk now.
It's pushed down.
Yeah. At some point in 2025. Again, I can't help but be an optimistic person. I don't know how I manage it writing about this stuff, but I'm hopeful that the outcry has been such that they can't get away with it again in the 6th talk. I don't know.
Yes.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But the focus has to be on reducing production. We have to decrease that production amount in order to have a hope of dealing with the amount of plastics in our lives.
Yes. And that's, we haven't really touched on yet some of the consequences of it, and you've definitely got examples of very real scenarios, real life people and countries that are having to deal with it from your book, which again are pretty shocking in terms of the scale of the problem, especially as you referred to earlier in developing countries. What examples would you like to share on that?
Yeah, well, the one that comes to mind, and what kind of got me into this topic, because I guess maybe I did used to have some sympathy for the idea that we could just recycle it, that plastics aren't in and themselves a problem as long as we recycle it.
I think to your point, they've done a very good job of telling us all that for many, many years now.
Yeah.
And I haven't read your other article yet about is recycling alive, but I certainly will because and I love the title because that will get people's attention, because I think everyone would say, well, it's okay. As long as we're recycling it, everything's going to be all right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we have all been conditioned to believe that. And so I think the majority of people would agree with that.
Yeah, I think so. And we all know, I guess, that there's a hierarchy of recyclability with plastics, and there's the little kind of logo on plastics, which most of us don't know what they mean, with numbers 1 to 5, I think it is. But the most recyclable plastic is PET, P-E-T. And I think a lot of people do think there's no problem with PET plastics, but it still becomes microplastics. So that the study on the IBD patients and the study of blood samples both included PET as the majority of the microplastics. So it may be getting recycled as a higher percentage of other plastics, still not 100%, by the way, PET even, but it's still ending up as microplastics and still ending up in our bodies. So it remains a big issue.
Yes.
But yes, so I think the guy that changed my mind on that one was a Ugandan campaigner called Nerere Sadrak, and he started a campaign called End Plastic Pollution Now in Uganda. He started this in 2019. And I spoke to him over video phone, and he showed me the River Wizzy, which is one of the major rivers in Uganda. And you may have seen more shocking photos of rivers completely clogged. This is a large, fast-moving river, so it's not going to be completely covered in plastic. But there's a lot of plastic flowing down this river. And then he also showed me some studies that him and his group had done on Lake Victoria, so the largest lake in Africa. And a lot of the shoreline there kind of had a thick, kind of gloopy sheen to the top of it. And that was microplastics. So he called it like a green plastic soup. It was just broken up plastic that had formed, a thick covering on the side of this great lake. And that's their local water supply, basically. That feeds into a lot of towns and cities. Uganda doesn't have the facilities to deal with that amount of plastic. But again, I would say no country has. No country has sorted this. So the UK, a lot of plastics that have been recycled, that we've put in our recycled column, have actually just been sent to other countries who have said, okay, we'll recycle it. And the UK can then tick their box and say, oh, that's recycled then. Yeah. But quite often it's not. Quite often it's dumped. Now, Nwere's point was they do plastic audits each year to kind of pick as much plastic as they can and see who the main producing companies are. And there's large names, the big names that we all know. Yeah. So he's saying, well, it's their issue to sort. We can't deal with this plastic. You've got to stop putting it into our economy at such volumes that we can't deal with it. Yeah. But yeah, it's a huge problem in a lot of developing countries, but it's also a huge problem in every country.
And the problem's coming to them. It's not it's not originating from them, is it? They're having to deal with the consequence of it. It's arriving at their door almost, isn't it?
Yeah, and in a really disingenuous way, in that, so if there's no recycling waste structure to deal with this, you can't, as a company, that is selling plastic products in large volume, just put your hands up and say, well, it's not our problem, it's your problem to deal with. You want this stuff. But if you're only being sold that stuff, you don't have much of a choice in the matter, really.
Yes. Yeah. And so in terms of, I'm wondering the impact that it has, especially getting into our food and that sort of thing, the unavoidable aspect of it. If it's not stopped at source or reduced at source, then that's unlikely to change, because it is just a chain of events that just happen by very nature of the way that it gets into the water, and then the water fuels life thereafter, right? So you talked about certainly about how animal life in the sea and that sort of stuff is consuming it, but also that's happening across the board, and in a way helping it to find its way to all of our plates, I suppose.
Yeah. I can tell I'm depressing you, Matt, and I'm gonna make it even worse, and then I'm gonna bring you back up again a little bit by the end. It appears to be my MO.
Yeah, yeah.
But so there's a study in seawaters just off the coast of England. It was a really simple study. It was basically just taking a scoop of seawater and seeing what was in it under the microscope, and it basically found an equal number of microplastics to plankton. Not just that, when the really interesting video, which we hopefully we will put in the blog, was taken under the microscope of a tiny zooplankton eating one tiny strand of microplastics, and it's a little fibre, so it's most likely from a piece of clothing, most likely from someone's washing machine. But I say eating, it obviously it kills it, because it just lodges in its digestive tract, and that's the end of that zooplankton. But it's a really fascinating and really depressing thing to see, because that's the bottom of our food chain, that's the base of our food chain. So if you think of everything going up from that, we're at the top of that food chain. If we're doing that to the base of our food chain, that has potentially very dire consequences. We're kind of dooming ourselves if we allow that to keep happening. But also then there's bioaccumulation of the fish that eat that, then we eat the fish and so on. Then, as I say, I'm going to take you even further down. There was a study by Japanese researchers this year that found microplastics for the first time in clouds. So because these are so small, this is in seawater. We all know that how the water cycle works from school. That is evaporating up in seawater into the clouds and then raining back down. So the microplastics are not just in our food chain now, they're also in our water cycle. So that's the grim reality of where we're at now. And that's why I was so angry with the results from Busan at the end of November, because
it's not just something that you want to be pushed down the line again. Another meeting next year, another meeting the year after.
But it's also not just something that's affecting some people, it's affecting every person, including people in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, you know, in the major oil producing countries. So it was a very literal, it felt very literal slap in the face to everyone on the part of just big money producing companies, because that's basically, we care more about this short-term boost in our economy than we care about a long-term effect on our people's health. That's why it was so upsetting. But and that is also why I'm more hopeful for the sixth talk. You have to have hope.
Yes. And of course, as things continue, especially with what you said about just the sheer scale of the accumulation of the problem and how every single year and therefore every single month it's getting worse. You know, I suppose one potential to lean into the optimism and hopefulness of it, you have it again in 6 months' time. It's a worse problem. It's a bigger problem in 6 months' time. And so you've got yet another 6 months for it to go up a level, and with that, hopefully the impact that it might have on people thinking about it. And
you're right. It's only getting a bigger problem by the day. And as I said, that doubling in the last 20-25 years is quite incredible. So I think almost it's taking us all by shock at the moment, just how ubiquitous microplastics are. How many medical studies each day seem to come up with a new microplastics appearing in a different organ. So hopefully that realization is starting to hit home now.
And I really like that you've provided us with this subject to talk about, because I work in the water kind of management industry. We deal with plastic products, but the majority of them are recycled and recyclable. But of course, as you've said, that doesn't make it a perfect solution by any stretch. But microplastics as a term, and as a term, is something I've heard a lot, but never properly spent any time looking into, and really, until this, never really took the time to learn much about it. And I'm sort of would be more invested in that as a subject than most people because of what I do for a living. So I'm really glad that we're introducing this to people that perhaps won't know anything about it. We're bound to have heard the word, of course, but everything starts with awareness, and I think that hopefully not just to depress them and make people worry about don't look up when it's raining, or don't eat this, or you know what I mean. Like you can take it too far, but the reality is the reality, and so it's helpful for people to know, and I think start to become a bit more conscious and make their own choices about what they do buy and what they, how they live and all that sort of stuff. So I think I'm really pleased that it's a topic that we've included, and I'm sure one will circle around on, because especially when positive news does come down the line, hopefully, it's a fascinating subject in itself.
Yeah, I think so. But let's get onto some of the ways people can reduce their exposure.
Absolutely.
Because the whole kind of the plastic credit cards worth of plastic each week is an average. So we can get that down. Yeah, I don't know what to, but we can get it down. So there'll be an end of a spectrum of either end. So what we drink and what we eat does have an impact on how much microplastics we are consuming.
Okay.
So as I mentioned earlier, tap water seems to be much safer than bottled water. And again, I think that'll come as a surprise to a lot of people. I think there are many people out there that are buying bottled water because of a lot of the scare stories of what's in our tap water.
Yes.
Now, there is a bigger issue about what else is in our tap water, yes, but there's also stuff in the bottled water. I mean, some bottled water companies have been found just to be filling it up with tap water anyway, but that's kind of a different subject. I'm sure the big brands aren't, so don't want to get into trouble.
Yeah.
But yeah, so drinking tap water is one. You can add filters to your taps. There are various kind of under sink filtration systems.
Yeah.
There are lots of water jugs you can use for filtration. However, having spoken to some water quality experts on this topic of plastics, they're not a huge fan of the plastic jugs because they are plastic. There's going to be a small amount of leaching each time you use a plastic jug.
Yeah.
So I personally now use a glass water jug with a charcoal filter suspended in it.
Yes.
But I brought it with me, Matt, because I thought we might get onto this.
Yeah.
So it's not actually the water jug I brought. But again, if you're bringing reusable bottles to drink in, use a aluminium one or a glass one. Again, most reusable jugs and reusable mugs and things are plastic based. So you can avoid those. This I don't normally have. Sorry if that's bad for the sound. I don't normally have in my bottle, but this is what I use at home in my drinking water.
Yeah.
It's not just a barbecue briquette.
Yeah.
you do. I won't say the make because I don't want to kind of plug a particular product.
No, indeed.
There are particular types of reactivated charcoal that you can put in your water.
I was at a restaurant not that long ago, and we received a bottle of water to the table, a glass bottle of water to the table that had one of these in it. Really? And it did catch him by surprise because you don't see it very often, first of all. And I did realise what it was because I am familiar with them, but I suddenly thought, initially it's like, well, what on earth that?
It is a conversation starter.
Yeah.
If people come into our house and the jug is on the table, which it always is.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Yes.
What's that?
But because it's, for those unfamiliar with it, it's normally that which is within the filter part of in the plastic housing of the water filter, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So reactivated charcoal has been used, kind of for millennia actually, but it's also part of the modern water treatment process. So the water treatment plant that kind of gets your water from the reservoir to your taps will use reactivated charcoal at one stage of the process. But in those water jugs that you buy, typically within the plastic casing, in the white plastic thing that you're supposed to recycle, will include reactivated charcoal. So it's kind of, you can cut out the middleman, just use the reactivated charcoal. And it would be a fair question to ask me exactly how the reactivated charcoal works. I don't know, but the very basics of it, as I've had it explained to me, is that it's essentially a kind of a sponge, so it attracts impurities to it. The impurities stick to it, so it wouldn't work immediately if I just popped it into that glass of water. It's not going to do much. But about 6 hours down the line, it will have attracted the impurities to it. So every few months, you have to kind of boil it to reactivate it again.
Okay. And I was going to ask if the life cycle of it, therefore, is something you have to consider.
I think they're supposed to last a year, and you can boil them twice in that year. From memory. I'd probably use it a bit longer than that. But it's a fairly natural process, and there's as you can see, no plastic involved in that. And as we've seen in the studies, microplastics in tap water is fairly minimal anyway. So I'm fairly hopeful that I'll be drinking my tap water through that filtration without any microplastics, or at least much reduced compared to if I'd had it in a plastic jug or some other option.
There's the other good thing about that. And we've talked about this, certainly within our business, we've talked about this with customers before in terms of saving water. And, It's so common, and I'm guilty of it myself. You want a cold glass of water, you open the tap, and you have to let it run for a bit before it's cold. And of course, most of that, if you think about how many people are doing that around the country and around the world, you are wasting, or we are collectively wasting a lot of water. The benefit of keeping your drinking water in a glass bottle like that with that in it would be that then presumably you could put that in the fridge if you wanted really cold water. You have to worry less basically about the fact that it being at the perfect temperature.
It's true. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that, but you're completely right. So yeah, the process of filling up a jug. Yeah, I'm not letting it run. I'm just
you're pouring
the first pour is going straight into it, putting it in the fridge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you've permanently got kind of nice chilled drinking water that's slightly better for you, and you're not wasting a half a glass full every time you're filling up.
Yeah, and most importantly, you're not buying plastic bottled water by the litre full, and not only having plastic waste to then get rid of, but also very likely having microplastics in your water that you're drinking.
Yeah.
And that's just the drinking water. So food-wise, the stuff we can do too.
Yeah.
This is where it gets a bit more complicated, but there will be likely benefits between organic and non-organic. Mm-hmm. There will be likely benefits between buying food, and I'm thinking mostly groceries here, but I guess most foodstuffs that aren't wrapped in plastic. Mm-hmm. So a plastic wrapping-free plastic will likely have less plastic leaching into that food whilst it's waiting on the shelf. But also then you don't have the plastic waste to get rid of at the end. I also read an interesting piece by a microplastic scientist who was talking about the way that she eats and feeds her family is to look for low food chain foods. Okay. So I think we're talking kind of more of a vegan diet, much more of a plant-based diet, eating grains, pulses and so on. Mm-hmm. There's less chance for plastics to bioaccumulate up those. Mm-hmm. So it's again a kind of a tick against red meat and large fish such as tuna, because there's a lot of bioaccumulation going up in those food chains. Yeah. With tuna as well, there's heavy metal bioaccumulation as well, which is why pregnant women are told not to eat more than a certain amount of tuna a week. But obviously they are a high risk group, but it's also true for all of us. Yes. So all of us shouldn't be eating tuna daily because of the mercury content. Yes. But then on today's topic, there's also a likely microplastics content of eating larger animals.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it looks at the same sort of the same aim, but for a very different reason. I was talking to someone recently whose daughter has recently, she'd moved home for a little while. She's early 20s, and she'd said to her parents, well, you don't buy any food with plastic on it, do you? And he was, we were talking because we were talking about the recycled plastic nature of some of our products. And he was saying, I'm not even, now that whilst his daughter's back living with him, he's not even allowed to buy anything from the supermarket that has plastic wrapping or, a plastic carton or whatever, which is perfectly possible. He was saying it's not easy, but it's achievable. Yeah. I was saying he was managing it. But that, as I understood it in the conversation I had with him, and just my own thinking, was to reduce the amount of plastic that they were then, having to get rid of and recycle and stuff. But of course, this is just doing the same thing, but so that the plastic is not necessarily making its way in the form of microplastic into the food that you're actually consuming.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it in that way before.
Yeah, and it is, I admit, a controversial issue. So there are some food waste campaigners who are fairly pro-plastic wrapping. Okay. Because it will keep that food for longer. So if you think of like a plastic, the classic is a plastic wrapped cucumber. Yeah. So if you think they're quite often shrink wrapped, that will have a longer shelf life, a longer lifespan. This will therefore, in theory, lead to less food waste. Yes. And you can use that same argument for most kind of plastic wrapped groceries. There is obviously some truth to that. Yeah. But where I have issue with that argument is, well, one, fairly recent research coming out that there is likely plastic leaching into that cucumber from that wrapping. So you're likely eating some plastic when you unwrap that cucumber. Yeah. But also, two, and I'm sure I'm not the only one guilty of this, it doesn't guarantee that doesn't end up as a brown mushy mesh in your fridge anyway. So you end up with the food waste and the plastic.
Yes.
So I think quite possibly if things weren't plastic wrapped, we would get more used to what their actual literal shelf life is, and maybe use them in time.
Behave accordingly.
Yeah, and behave accordingly, and not have to eat any plastic, and then not have to get rid of the plastic.
Yes.
Because that shrink wrap covering of your cucumber is not recyclable.
No, indeed. I was thinking that
there's no waste stream for that.
Absolutely.
So that's just ending up in our rivers and seas.
Yes.
So I don't have much time for the food waste argument.
No, indeed. And
I'm happy to hear from anyone that does. I'm honestly happy to have that debate.
I can join you and hold my hands up and say I am definitely guilty of it not preventing the wastage of cucumbers.
Doubly depressing.
Yeah, quite. That is a very good point. But it's also an example of how connected all of these things are.
Yeah.
Especially when you relate it back to water, because as you was talking about cucumbers, I was remembering, I think one of the first conversations we had about the water it takes to make an avocado, and I know it's different entirely. Avocados seem to be, you have to be some sort of psychic or whatever to get them ripe when you want to eat them anyway. You need some sort of telepathic power to be able to choose which ones to take and which ones not to, and a lot are wrapped in plastic, and then equally a lot aren't. But when you connect all these things together, you realize that it is all related somehow. And I think that, again, one of the very first things we said on episode 1 is just talking about it, being aware of it, not necessarily trying to change your behavior and live completely differently, but be conscious of it.
Yeah, it's being conscious and reducing your impact, right? I think there's too much made of kind of forcing people to elimination, kind of purity or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with that at all. I think it's just, if you can make incremental improvements, great. That is having a big impact.
Yeah.
So again, clothing, I guess, is another one. So looking for natural fibers.
Mm-hmm.
Natural fiber carpets and sofas also have a big impact.
Yeah.
So annoyingly, I have plastic versions of both, because in our house we have a moth problem, which will eat any natural fibers.
Right.
So it's not straightforward. It's not an all or nothing.
No.
But trying to move towards more natural fibers in our clothing and in our furnishings does have an impact.
Yes.
And then I need to look into a filter on my washing machine.
Mm-hmm.
I have not yet done that. But that's on my list.
Yeah.
So that you can add filters that will stop the microfibers going out and into out with the wastewater.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Quite what you then do with the microfibers you've captured, I'm not fully sure.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's better than just going out into the wastewater.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's about reducing our impact, reducing our exposure, and just one household or one person changing some natural fibers and not getting plastic wrapped vegetables isn't going to make a big difference to those global figures I was talking about. That is where we need politicians to step up.
Yeah.
That's their job, and that's what we need them to do now.
Yeah.
But it will have an impact on your own personal exposure.
Yes.
So there is something we can do about it for our own health and our own family's health.
And hopefully cut that credit card in half or something like that.
Reduce
perhaps.
that credit card use.
It's not. Hopefully, hopefully I'm not alone in thinking that is actually a very interesting takeaway from this conversation. Hopefully not too worrying, but it's it's factual. It's come from somewhere.
Yeah, and if it is worrying and it makes you angry, then good. That we should be telling our politicians this is unacceptable. Yeah. We should be saying what happened in Busan, just a collapse in talks because some oil producing countries shoved you over.
Yeah.
We should be saying that is unacceptable. Yeah. This is affecting all of our lives, all of our health.
Absolutely.
So, yes. And the idea that it's impossible to deal with at a global level is also untrue. So we had a very similar issue in the 80s. We all remember, anyone that's of a certain age, of CFCs.
Uh-huh.
CFCs were causing a hole in the ozone layer. They were ubiquitous. They were in all of our sprays, spray cans, deodorants. They're in all of our refrigerators. It seemed equally impossible. The UN, all the countries came together and agreed to phase out CFCs in the Montreal Protocol. I forget the year. I think it's 1991 or 1987. But that works. We don't talk about holes in the ozone layer anymore, because there was a global agreement to phase out the problem, phase out the chemical that was causing that problem. Yes. So there can be a global agreement now to phase out plastic production. Yeah, I say phase out. It can only ever be reduced. I can't quite imagine a life without plastics, but there can be a life without many unnecessary plastic. Yeah. We use plastics in such a kind of unnecessary way at the moment. Yeah. If we got rid of all the single-use plastics, all the unnecessary plastics, I think that's close to problem solved. Would make it easier. Yeah, and that is doable. And there can be a global agreement on that. Yes. Hopefully in 2025. Yeah, hopefully in 2025.
No, absolutely. Well, I think I've certainly learned lots, and hopefully others have as well. There's definitely a few bits to take away. As I will remind people, the article that you have contributed is on the website. So if anyone wants to read a little more, go there, watermatters.life, and take a read of that. And we look forward to bringing you more interesting subjects. I think we're covering all sorts on Water Matters. There are lots of Water Matters to discuss that do have an impact on people's lives, such as this, that people should be aware of. And all we would remind you of and kind of ask you to do, as ever, as we did right from the start, is just to take these conversations home with you. Talk to other people about it, ask people questions, see what your friends and family know about microplastics, and how much awareness is there out there. And then if you do have any questions for us, of course, we're always reachable through the watermatters.life website and the newsletter. If you subscribe, you can always hit reply and share your questions. I can make sure that they get through to Tim if you want a more qualified reply than anything I might send to you. But it's a two-way conversation. So please do ask anything, and also share it with your friends, family, colleagues, other people that should also be aware of these water matters that we're discussing and bringing to the surface. So thank you once again, Tim, for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Good, thank you. And thanks for listening. We look forward to, we'll take this opportunity to wish you a good few weeks until the next time. And yes, thanks for listening. Back with more Water Matters soon.